You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Muley Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Muley Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Everybody knows I'm a Muley fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Coursey.
All right, welcome to Wild Things and Wild Places. Joining me today, I've got Phil Lockwood, who is a fire management specialist with the BLM High Desert District Office. You're based out of the Kemmerer Field Office, is that correct?
That is correct.
I'm glad we've been able to dot all the I's and cross all the T's. It's proved to be a little bit of a challenge to try to get this podcast set up, as there is a protocol here when you're talking with the federal government. I'm sure you know all about the bureaucracy of working for the federal government. But Phil, let's start us just a little bit on you. You're a Wyoming native.
I am not a Wyoming native.
You're not?
Family that's been here for a long time.
Okay.
I moved to Wyoming in 2001.
Where'd you move here from?
I came from Fort Worth, Texas.
Oh, wow. Okay. So quite the change.
Quite the change. I came up for a summer job working for the Forest Service clearing trails, and I never left. This is amazing.
Yeah, here you are 22 years later and still here.
Yeah, I don't know of a better place to be. So
tell me how you got your career started. Obviously, if you were doing some sort of summer program with the Forest Service, you can get your foot in the door with the federal agency, and then that kind of spurs other opportunities that present themselves. But you're now employed with the BLM. How long have you been with them?
I've been at the BLM since 2011.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And when you first started with BLM, what was your job?
I was the fuels technician.
Meaning
we were implementing fuels projects, whether it's prescribed burns, doing fuels reductions around communities, vegetation management, but more the implementation phase of that, where in my current job, it's more of the planning phase, planning through implementation.
And your current job as a fire management specialist, if you were to give an overview of that, what does that entail? I know there's a lot of duties and responsibilities with that occupation, but specific to you and your charge, what does that look like?
Specific to me, we're dealing with fire management, so fire suppression, as well as fuels management, which is the vegetation management as a whole. So it can be anything from weed control to reducing fuels around communities, reducing fuels around infrastructure, vegetation management, planning for fires in the future.
Big undertaking that.
It is. A lot of land to cover.
Yeah, when you have this much public land in western Wyoming, it's a huge responsibility.
Yes, it is.
So your acreage of responsibility, do you have that, or do you know roughly what that entails?
Roughly, we're about 1.7 million acres of BLM land in the Kemmerer Field Office.
Okay.
And I do work for the High Desert District. So we have the entire district, which is about 17 million acres. And I'm stationed in the Kemmerer Field Office, but help out with all the other field offices in the district.
What spurred my interest in wanting to have this conversation with you specifically is a project that we have actually allocated some money to through the BLM, but are leveraging other partners to support this project. In our previous episode, which will now be 2 episodes ago, part 1 episode with Director Nesvik, he referred to cheatgrass as the cancer of Wyoming, and it certainly is. And that's where I think we make the connection and the tie directly to mule deer and how important the landscape, the habitat, the vegetation is for a sustainable herd population. But when you look at cheatgrass and the spread of cheatgrass, there are a ton of efforts and a lot of financial resources, hours of manpower being dedicated to combat cheatgrass. Do you think we're winning?
I wouldn't say we're winning, but we're holding our own at this time. We didn't know we had the problem with cheatgrass that we had until we really got into trying to treat cheatgrass. I think to understand where we're at with cheatgrass and whether we're winning or not, I think we've got to go back to where we started when we started managing cheatgrass in this field office. When I got here in 2011, I knew very little about cheatgrass. We had fought fires in the Great Basin, Nevada, southern Idaho, and we fought fires with cheatgrass. That fires were spreading faster, fires were getting larger, fires were burning more frequently than they had in the past, and that was all I knew about cheatgrass. It was there, and it was having an effect on fires in that part of the country. And that sagebrush lands were changing over to cheatgrass, see the cheatgrass. But that's all I knew. When we got here, or when I got to Kemmerer, we had a fire right before I got here in 2010, just north of Evanston. And it was a 5,000 acre fire. And we started to see cheatgrass coming back up in that fire scar the next year in 2011. Our range specialists and wildlife biologists were seeing that. So we sprayed that burn scar in 2013. And it was very effective. We saw much less cheatgrass come back up in the next couple of years. We're like, this is interesting. This is positive that we're able to control this a little bit, but it's also a problem that is here. And so we decided to start putting a lot more money and time into finding cheatgrass, monitoring for cheatgrass, and attempting to control cheatgrass.
So essentially the last decade, since 2013, has really been the efforts to try to remedy this and mitigate how you can to further its spread. Most vulnerable landscapes, it sounds, are immediately following a fire.
Cheatgrass is very disturbance tolerant and thrives with disturbance. Any type of disturbance, whether we build a road, any infrastructure that goes in, fire goes through, overgrazing, anything like that, cheatgrass is able to come in very quickly if there's any of it present in the area.
Yeah, and it's not native.
No, it is non-native. Came over from Europe. Mediterranean is where it's native to. It came over to the United States as a contaminant, and shipping it came over, and it is spread pretty rapidly, and it's found in all the 48 lower states.
Wow. Yeah, significant.
Yes.
And when you talk about how important, particularly with mule deer and the decline in mule deer populations over the last 3 decades, it starts with nutrition.
Absolutely.
And so you play a very valuable role in the conservation of mule deer, whether you realize it or not. I'm assuming you've connected those dots that there's many benefits to this, but you could break this down to a very small level and say it's benefiting this, it's benefiting that, all across the board.
Absolutely. And living here in Wyoming and as a hunter, mule deer are very important to me. And seeing how they use the landscape and how the landscape's changing with cheatgrass, you can see the negative impacts on mule deer. It's very important to me that we do our best to control this to help the habitat of the mule deer.
Do you believe that there is still a lot of misinformation or just a lack of information or just a lack of education to how some of these landscapes, people that have had generational experience on these lands, you can say, gosh, it doesn't look like the land has changed that much. But when you start looking at the forbs and the forage, the mountain mahogany, the bitter brush, things that have just been replaced with cheatgrass, it may not be as noticeable at first glance, but you're seeing a wild spread.
Absolutely. And to go back to when we started in 2000, we didn't know, we couldn't see it, how much of an impact it was already having. When we started treating cheatgrass, we thought, okay, we have it along the Utah border and we have it along the Idaho border. We're like, okay, we know of a couple larger infestations and a couple previous fire scars, but let's go find the other areas where it is. Let's put a lot of time into this, and let's find the areas we have cheatgrass, and let's work on controlling those. We don't want that problem here. We put more money than we had put into monitoring and into treatment back in 2013, 2015. We really went out there and we're like, we need to find this. We got a plan together with our local staff, with our range cons and biologists, and we went up and we contracted a helicopter and we flew the western half of the field office. We're like, let's find those little isolated pockets of cheatgrass that have spread. Let's go control those and work our ways back to the borders. And let's knock this thing out before it's a problem. We got up in the air, started flying around, and realized this was not an isolated problem. Everywhere in the western half of the field office, below about 8,000 foot of elevation, we had little spots of cheatgrass all over. And so we couldn't even see it when we're out on the ground all the time trying to manage this vegetation. So it was a big problem then, and the problem has just gotten larger. Our presence of cheatgrass has spread, and there's more cheatgrass in those areas where there might have been 5% cheatgrass 10 years ago. There might be 10% cheatgrass now.
Yeah, wow. I know the director of the Game and Fish Department recently, the commission approved, this is kind of Director Nesvik's, this is what keeps him awake at night, specific to wildlife and how important habitat and vegetation is to wildlife and their nutrition. They've allocated $5 million as a state agency, but I would have to think, and you would know, is it fair to say that BLM has expended more money than anybody in this effort at this point?
I can't say that for a fact, but I know that we're putting in a lot of money for cheatgrass control. Last year, just in the Kemmerer Field Office, we spent over $1 million on cheatgrass control.
Okay.
And so we're spending at least $1 million a year on spraying cheatgrass. Just
out of this field office.
Just out of this field office. And we're seeing positive effects. Where we spray, we're doing really well. And we're lowering that prevalence of cheatgrass.
Your sister agency, or the other federal partner of management of land that is owned by the feds, you're the Forest Service, similar situation?
They got into the ballgame a little later than we did, but they didn't have the infestations as early as we did. With the elevational changes, they're a little higher than we are and a little different fuel types. They have more timber and less sage grass. They just have less of the cheatgrass, but it's becoming more and more prevalent, especially along the major travel ways, say the Grays River Road, LaBarge Creek Road, places where people are accessing the Forest Service and coming off of the BLM or off the private lands onto the Forest Service, and they are treating pretty aggressively.
Has it changed with your prior experience so tied to the fire aspect of management? When you have a fire like a few years ago, the Pole Creek fire, does this become a priority that maybe wasn't a priority years past just because of this new scar on the landscape and its vulnerabilities?
Absolutely. If we have any type of disturbance, whether it's a fire or anything else, we're looking at treating that for cheatgrass immediately.
Let's talk specific about the treatment, because there's a lot of talks about the treatment, a lot of probably, again, misinformation or some unknowns. Currently, the treatments that you guys are able to use and apply, they consist of what?
Really, on a large scale, our main treatment type is a mazepec or plateau, which we're aerially applying out of a helicopter or fixed wing aircraft. And that's what we can use at a landscape level.
Okay. And the criteria for being able to get the green light to make that happen, what does that process look like?
The process on our side isn't that complicated. We have a large-scale EIS that was completed for the 15 western states that allows us to spray that chemical on BLM lands. And then in Pinedale, Kemmerer, and Rock Springs, we completed an EA that tiered down off of that allowed us to spray BLM lands with.
A couple of acronyms you've said there, which I know you live in the world of acronyms, but just for folks that may not know, EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, and then your EA acronym that you mentioned.
Environmental Assessment.
Okay. Yeah, I know you live in a world of acronyms and work for the Bureau of lots of meetings, but yeah, I just thought maybe a little clarification there so folks realize that there is a process. Time of year, have you found that have you learned different times of year work better than others?
Yeah, we've learned as we've gone through this. Mazepec or plateau is recommended to be sprayed in the fall, and we've learned that we can spray a little earlier than we initially were spraying. We used to spray at the end of September into the beginning of October, which brought on its own challenges. You're mixing a chemical with water and then flying it and spraying it out of a helicopter in maybe freezing temperatures, maybe not. We had a lot of problems trying to spray at that time of year, thawing out the nozzles on the helicopter, fighting, is it going to be warm enough to spray? Can we spray before it gets too windy? And it was really complicated. We started slowly spraying earlier in the year and seeing the same effects.
Okay.
We're spraying now August through mid-October.
And the longevity of this treatment?
Longevity of these treatments with this chemical is approximately 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
Once we spray an area, say it has 15% cheatgrass in it, once we spray the next year, we're probably going to get down under 5%. So we're being effective. We're not completely getting rid of the cheatgrass, but we are being effective in knocking it back. And then that percentage will stay around 5% for a couple of years. And then once we approach 4 to 5 years, it might be jumping back up to that 10% type range. And then we may have to retreat again.
And the plateau does not seem to have any other adverse effects to any native shrubs or grasses?
We've seen very minimal effect. Once again, this was a learning thing for us. The amount of chemical we were spraying per acre at the beginning, we've changed. We've gone up, we've gone down, just to try to check that we're not hurting these native plants here that the livestock and the wildlife rely on. So we've bumped up and up until we started seeing some effects, and then we've bumped back down.
Okay.
And so at the current rates that we're applying chemical, we are seeing little to no effect on our native vegetation. In a couple other places, they have seen effects on things like bitterbrush. And in a couple other areas around the state, they have stopped spraying in the areas that contain bitterbrush, just so they don't have that impact on those native plants.
Yeah, so there seems to be, and I'd like just to have your opinion on this, so not necessarily the agency's thoughts on this, but to you specifically, you've probably heard that there are several folks that are just pushing and are excited for the day when the BLM approves the application of Rejuva. The Forest Service, the other federal partner, they've already approved it and have touted it to be very successful. What do you know about that?
From what I've seen with it, we have sprayed Rejuva on private lands adjacent to the BLM. We work with our cooperators, we work with the private landowners, and we have sprayed this side by side. And we're seeing good results both from plateau and Rejuva.
Okay.
The Rejuva results seem to be a little longer lasting and may last in that 8 to 10 year range, where the plateau may only last at 4 to 5 year range.
Okay. Big cost difference?
There is a big cost difference, and that's what we're grappling with at this point. With us getting $1 million to spray cheatgrass now, we're able to spray 30,000 acres a year. If we move to Rejuvra and we spend 3 times as much, we're going to be able to spray a third of the acreage that we've been spraying.
So this really could be a problem that maybe it just does take deeper pockets and more money to be able to.
Absolutely.
Specific to treatments, one thing that was, I thought, very insightful in our visit a few weeks ago, we were talking about a project that we're putting money towards as a foundation, but looking at, and you had some historical documentation that you provided on the spraying of cheatgrass, the number of acres going back to 2016, which at that time was just a little bit less than 2,500 acres. And if you were to put this on a chart, it's like this constant upward trend until you get to really 2021 and then into 2022. And then it's like this vertical spike. In 2022, you guys, your field office almost treated 38,000 acres compared to just 2,500 acres in 2016. There's certainly a priority that's been placed on this, but like, how can someone understand this growth in not only the monitoring, but then the application? What has prioritized this to move it at such a great pace that is truly making a tremendous impact?
Our partners have really helped us prioritize these things. We work really closely with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. We work really close with our weed and pest districts, Lincoln County and Uintah County Weed and Pest District, and they've allowed us to treat this amount of acres and have helped us lower the cost as well. The more chemical you buy, the less you can get the chemical for. The more you've worked with a certain contractor, you can just make better relationships and get better results quicker. And then all these agencies have sister agencies, Forest Service, the Game and Fish. We've all come together to show that this is such a problem, and it's been prioritized up to the national level.
That sounds very similar to how the conservation community works. It's all about leverage and collaboration. I mean, that partnerships, that's what it really is amounting to, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we have great partners with Muley Fanatics that provided money for this project going back into, I believe, 2017. I think we had money from you guys, and Elk Foundation has provided money, and many other groups have provided money to help with this process.
The fuels accomplishments that were on your chart, there was more than just cheatgrass. I know that's one. It's getting a lot of attention. A lot of people are talking about it. But when you do this in combination or in collaboration with all these other efforts, logging, juniper thinning, mowing, all of those collectively is really what's going to provide the healthy habitat we need for wildlife resource, right?
Absolutely. And it's a lot to juggle when we've increased to spraying 10 times what we were just 5 to 6 years ago. We have to balance that workload with those mowings, with the juniper thinning, all these other things. But those are also very important. We don't want to push them to the side just to spray cheatgrass.
Is there an example on the landscape where you have just seen firsthand where you can just say, this is working and this is working well?
I would really say in a lot of the winter areas of the Wyoming range mule deer, where we have been spraying cheatgrass, where we had when we first started a 15% cheatgrass prevalence.
Okay.
And we've sprayed multiple times now, every 3 to 4 years. And we're saying 3 to 4% now. We can hold it at that level.
Right.
And because we're able to continually treat these areas, we can still do the other types of treatments, which will help deer and help other wildlife and help livestock. We can still thin the juniper. We're putting a disturbance on the ground, but we're not having the cheatgrass come and replace the disturbance that we're creating because the chemical's already there. We're continually doing these treatments. We're able to thin the juniper. We're able to do some sagebrush mowings and help get newer, healthier plants growing there for the wildlife and for the livestock. And it's working well together.
Have you put a focused effort specific to mule deer winter range? I would assume that's where when you get partners like Game and Fish involved, that they've prioritized that. Is that a priority for your field office as well?
It is a priority. When the Mule Deer Initiative came out, and we had the Wyoming Range Mule Deer Initiative, when it started back in 2010, we became partners with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. They put a habitat biologist in charge of just the Wyoming Range mule deer area that we work with on a daily basis. And so we gone out public meetings, we've met with all our cooperators, adjacent landowners, And we came up with a plan on how to treat mule deer habitat throughout our field office. So it's one of our biggest priorities.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, it's great to hear. That's music to my ears. Specific to the monitoring process and to be able to quantify or measure the effectiveness of this, what does that process look like? At what time of year does that occur?
That process is a really big process. So if we are treating over 30,000 acres a year, that's 30,000 acres of treatment that we need to monitor, and then monitor all the areas that we didn't treat. So you potentially would be monitoring over 1 million acres a year. And I personally can't go monitor all of that in 1 year. So our partners, once again, the Game and Fish is very helpful in our monitoring. And they do probably 50% plus of our monitoring. We do contract some monitoring out that relates back to our range monitoring. We can combine a lot of our monitoring efforts. If a crew is going out to monitor range condition, we're also going to have them monitor for cheatgrass prevalence as well.
Fascinating. When you talk about the relationship with private landowners and being able to work with private landowners to apply this on their lands, obviously they have a regard for wildlife. I don't know any landowner that doesn't have a high regard for wildlife, but they also have their own domestic stock. Any impacts to this that is showing just an increase in landowners wanting to address this, knowing that it's causing a problem for them and their domestic stock?
Absolutely. When we first started, we knew we had to treat the private. We couldn't just treat BLM and leave the private, stop at the fence line, and then let it seed back in. So at the beginning, we had a few landowners that were very involved and wanted to help. As we've moved forward and they've seen negative results of cheatgrass taking over some of their lands, and others have seen the positive effects of what we've been doing, both on BLM and private, people have jumped on board. And we have a lot of people wanting to engage with us, not only help us out and allow us to spray their lands, but provide money to help with this process.
The application of what you did this year was probably the previous year's plan?
That's correct.
So you're working now on next year's plan?
Yeah, so next year's plan, we already have a preliminary plan in place. I said there's a lot of planning that has to go into this. We have to have wildlife approval. We're not going to hurt anything that's out there. We have to have cultural clearances done so that we're not going to impact any of these other things on the ground that we're charged with managing as the BLM. So we have to plan ahead. So we have a pretty good plan for next year, and realistically have a plan for the next 5 years.
Really?
Those plans aren't set in place. So as we go monitor and we find new things, or we find out that maybe a treatment didn't work as well as we wanted to, we need to go back and retreat that. We can move those things around and make them fit, but we have planned out multiple years ahead.
And then you always have the unplannable thing of a fire.
Absolutely.
And then that becomes priority?
It does at that point.
It does? Okay. Wow. I think it's fascinating to know that maybe a lot of sportsmen and sportswomen don't realize some of the behind-the-scenes efforts that are sportsmen, I think, have almost become calloused in some regards to hearing that the culprit of declining mule deer populations is habitat. And it's not as noticeable when you're looking at it from a 30,000-foot view, but when you can dial this in with the precision that you have to be able to have these specific targets of treatment, I think I just find it to be fascinating. It does start with the groceries at the end of the day. That is where the healthy herds need to be able to sustain themselves, and this is certainly an impact. When you talk about mule deer specifically, as a hunter, as a sportsman, as someone who has chosen to make Wyoming their home, I'm sure you have a lot of concerns in the changes you've seen with the mule deer herd. What are some of those concerns that you have that maybe you just think we need to be talking about a little bit more?
I think my concerns, they go back to habitat.
Do they?
They really go back to habitat. Of course, following this last winter and seeing the reduction in mule deer on the landscape, that's terrible to see. But if we have the habitat, we can get that population back. So my concerns are where the habitat is now, how we can improve that habitat so that we can get more deer back on the landscape.
Right. Obviously, coming out of last year and then the amount of moisture that we had this year, you would think that the landscape is very optimistically in a position to recharge itself and regenerate itself. But it wasn't that long ago, and certainly in your time in tenure with the BLM, drought is a major player.
Absolutely.
When you talk about monitoring and doing the index results on sagebrush and some of these key things in winter range, things look good right now because we've had a lot of moisture. But gosh, it wasn't that long ago. We were behind the 8 ball.
Absolutely. And that just goes to show why we're working on all these other kinds of treatments as well, and not just focusing on cheatgrass. We are continuing to work in our sagebrush stands and make sure that we have healthy sagebrush, and working on thinning juniper where it's encroaching into the sagebrush, working on regenerating aspen stands through prescribed fire and those types of things. So we are continually working on habitat.
Yeah, no, that's all good information. When you look at these maps, and of course, not being a podcast, you're not being able to see these maps like you and I can in front of us, but you see these polygons that are on these maps. How do you determine for next year's plan? Where are you just looking at areas adjacent to what you've already done so you can keep moving in the same direction? How do you get these little pockets that are like far removed? This all kind of makes sense. They're all congruent. They all seem to have some sort of parallel to each other, and it looks like you're just expanding the efforts. But then you get some of these that are just so isolated. Was it just because it was so thick and dense?
It really depends. All of them are a little different. The map you're referring to is the map from the Southern Wyoming Range Mule Deer Enhancement Project. So that was a big NEPA exercise we went through. We wrote a large EA, or environmental assessment, specifically for mule deer habitat throughout the Kemmerer Field Office and around the Wyoming Range. We were focusing on transitional habitat and winter habitat for mule deer. And in that document, we approved treatments on over 300,000 acres of BLM land.
Wow.
So in doing that planning, we identified many different smaller treatment areas underneath those 300,000 acre big planning blocks. And we're slowly working our way through those and making sure that we can build on top of previous treatments we've already done, but also not treat everything at the same time. We don't want to go into one area and do a prescribed burn and a mowing and a thinning right next to each other and get rid of those groceries all at one time.
Right.
We want to treat an area here, then treat an area miles away so that there's still vegetation there that year while it's regrowing in the area that we treated.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. I would think that having those various age structures of vegetation is part of having the combination to a healthy habitat.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're really looking at age class diversity
right
throughout these project areas.
Okay. Biggest challenge? I know there's some challenges.
There are challenges. We work for the federal government. It's a big machine. It's very slow moving.
Right.
This project that you're referring to, the map there with the Southern Wyoming Range Mule Deer Project, that took us about 8 years to complete the planning effort for that project. So there's a lot of work that goes into doing anything on the ground. And there's changing priorities throughout our organization. And so you have to fit in those treatments that you started planning 8 to 10 years ago with the priorities of your organization that are the current priorities that are out there.
So do you put together some sort of wish list that you submit to your district manager that then gets submitted to the state that ultimately gets rubber stamped back in DC? What does that look like?
So our process, we apply for funding internally, and basically say everything that we could accomplish if we had all the money in the world.
Right.
We could burn this many acres. We could thin this many acres. We could spray this many acres. We put in what we could actually accomplish and put that out there
for that next fiscal year.
Okay. And so every field office and every district is doing this across the country. And then we put that in. It all has to be approved at our local level, and it works its way up. And then when Congress does pass a budget and we get the amount of money that we're allocated, they have to divvy that up nationally, and then at the state level, divvy up how much money we actually get. And we have to decide what's the most important of our projects so that we're not going to get all the money we want, but prioritize with the projects that we said we could get done this year, what we want to do.
So essentially, even within the state of Wyoming, you're competing with other field offices.
We are, but in our district, we work really well together. And so when we do our applications for our funding, when we put that in for the fiscal year, we're working very closely together and making sure that my field office doesn't take all the money from Rock Springs field office, and that we work together and we understand what we can accomplish and what's the most important within our district on any given year.
Yeah. How much time is consumed with you prepping this type of process?
This is what we do all year long.
Is it?
I don't think you could really put a number on it. This is what we're doing every day.
Okay. Surely not as satisfying as being in the field.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. When I started at that tech position, my job was in the field and implementing these projects. And now it's a lot of time on the phone, talking to our cooperators, a lot of time sitting in meetings, talking to my counterparts. How can we use this money best? How can we share funding, personnel, equipment with each other to get these projects done? But a lot of time in the office and in meetings now.
Yeah. Have you seen an implementation of new advances or new technology helping make this more efficient and overall just a better result in product?
Absolutely. The more we do any of these types of treatments, just the better we get at them, the more efficient that we are. And we can learn from the other states, the other field offices on what worked for them, what didn't work for them. Hopefully don't make the same mistakes they might have made. Share that information, share what kind of equipment that we need to be able to efficiently put these projects on the landscape. And we're coming a long way.
Yeah. When you look at Wyoming as a whole, and you look at the progress that Wyoming has made with wildlife crossings, an executive order from Governor Gordon to protect mule deer migration corridors, as a representative of Wyoming's BLM, but ultimately the federal government's BLM, is Wyoming leading the way?
We're doing really well.
Okay.
Really well. I don't want to make too many comparisons between us and the other states, but
are there some other success stories from other states that are shining stars?
Utah is doing some great things with their management.
Okay.
Idaho is also doing really well. I can't speak for some of the other states that are farther away, but we look to those adjacent states that are doing similar things to us so that we can learn from each other, and they look to us as well.
Is there a state out there that has had more of an impact with cheatgrass? Nevada, for example? Is there another place out there that has it a lot worse than we, or is it across the board a pretty grim picture for its invasiveness?
I would say it's a more grim picture in those places like Nevada and Utah and Idaho that had big infestations of cheatgrass earlier than we did. And they just started out a little bit more behind the eight ball. We were able to jump on it fairly quickly and been able to hold it back more than they were able to. So when they started treating cheatgrass in let's say Nevada, there was already big infestations, areas that were mostly cheatgrass, and they've struggled to catch up to that. Once your area becomes pure cheatgrass, if you go in and treat the cheatgrass, there's nothing left there to reseed. Can't get the sagebrush back. It's not going to happen.
Just don't.
You have to seed that. You have to plant. There's a lot more work that has to be done if you get to that point. We were fortunate enough to learn from those other states and be able to treat early before we had a lot of these just pure cheatgrass.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point that spurs a question for me, Phil, and that is in these areas where you have this year alone 35,000 acres, last year 38,000 acres. Those are significant strides of improvement from previous years. It's certainly a dedicated effort, but is there reseeding or replanting efforts that are taking place on these treated landscapes?
In our areas, we have not done reseeding or replanting. We haven't got to the point yet where that's been needed. Okay. We still have that native vegetation out there, those perennial grasses, the sagebrush, the bitterbrush. Things we want to be there are still there. So we haven't had to go to the reseeding yet.
Which really probably just hammers home the message of how important this is to be on it and at it early.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. And have you seen those native shrub communities? Do they start to thrive when you knock back that cheatgrass?
They definitely do better as we knock back the cheatgrass. The cheatgrass is very good at invading. It is what it does. It comes on early. It's a winter annual plant, so it germinates in the late fall with a fall precipitation event. It begins to germinate, which allows it to green up earlier than any of our native plants, any of our perennials, our sagebrush, any of the stuff that's going to start growing is still in a dormant status when cheatgrass pops up. So cheatgrass starts growing early in the spring, greens up quickly, starts taking in sunlight, the nutrition and nutrients that it needs out of the soil and the water that's in the soil, and starts using that very quickly while other plants are still dormant. So it gets a head start on all our other native vegetation. So it's able to grow quickly. Then when our native preferred plants start coming online, they're already at a disadvantage to cheatgrass. They've lost those nutrients. They've lost some of that soil moisture, and the cheatgrass is already thriving.
It's the name.
Exactly why it's called cheatgrass.
Yeah.
And so it just gets that head start that our other plants aren't able to have. So if we can remove that cheatgrass, that soil moisture, those nutrients, they're still there, and our native plants don't have to compete with a invasive species that has an advantage.
Yeah. The other thing I think maybe some folks who aren't and haven't been following this and the priority that this has been given this, and the other part of this is that it's lacking nutritional value. It's not of benefit.
Absolutely. When cheatgrass comes online early, because it comes online so early and it gets growing and it greens up early while everything else is still dormant, at that point, once it matures, it does have a minimal nutritional value. Not great, but it does have some value and can be used by livestock and can be used by wildlife. But because it starts so early, it also cures out so early. So it cures out, and once it produces seeds and it loses its nutritional value, it starts to turn to that tannish color,
right,
and it's no longer has a value for wildlife and for livestock. There's a very short window
right,
when things can actually use that.
I think it's fascinating you've been able to give some insight and share on this. I appreciate your biggest challenge, but your biggest satisfaction as well?
Biggest satisfaction is going to these areas that we saw with 15% cheatgrass 10 years ago and going back to them and seeing them thriving where there is still some cheatgrass. You go out there to do your monitoring and you're like, these perennials look great. The sagebrush is looking great. There's wildlife using these. Just to see some results of what you're doing.
Right.
A lot of our treatment types, we may not see the results in our lifetime, where cheatgrass is something that we can see those results in a year.
Huge priority for the state?
This is a huge priority for the state.
Is there a higher priority?
I cannot think of a higher priority.
Yeah.
I would say this is probably the highest priority.
Director Nesvic's comments, I think that if you ruminate on that a little bit and you just think about something being referred to as the cancer of Wyoming, is that fair?
I think it is very fair.
Phil, tremendous information. I know some folks are going to be like, gosh, how could you get excited about that? Oh, this is where it starts. If you want to talk about conservation, you want to talk about the recovery of a declining mule deer population, it's going to start with being able to have healthy moms and fawns on the ground. And that starts with the landscape and the nutrition that is there. So to me, this is like step one. If you want to go A to Z, you got to start at A.
Absolutely.
Phil, I appreciate your time on this. I appreciate your insight. You're 11 years into this career now. Where do you want to be 10 years from now?
I enjoy what I do.
Do you?
And I can't see myself going anywhere else or doing anything else.
It's rewarding, isn't it?
It is rewarding.
Hey, man, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh.
You bet.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a muley fanatic.